tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The global economy is on the brink of a major disaster, and that's no exaggeration. This time, the spotlight is on major German automakers such as Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW, which have just reported a staggering 40 profits for first quarter of 2025. The reason? Declining sales in China and the serious consequences of the trade war between the US and Europe. But this is only the beginning, because despite all their efforts, the giants of the automotive industry are facing a threat that could completely change the rules of the game.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
It all started quietly. No, it wasn't a press release or a loud statement on stage. It was a pause in deliveries, empty shipping schedules, and tense silence from Europe's largest automakers. But on May 23, 2025, the situation changed dramatically. US President Donald Trump issued an ultimatum, a 50% tariff on all goods from the European Union if car manufacturers did not move their production to the US. This move shook not only the automotive market, but global trade as a whole. No compromises. Either manufacture in America or pay a huge price.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
And here's what happened next. German car giants did not give up, but they froze. Volkswagen, BMW, Audi, Porsche, and Mercedes-Benz did not rush to close their factories, but they began to review their strategies. Complex logistics chains, production, and supplies are now all under threat. More importantly, the American market, which used to be a gold mine for them, could now become a no-go zone.
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
And what about prices? German brands are starting to raise the cost of their cars, and the most popular models, such as the Audi Q5 and BMW 2 series, are becoming unaffordable for many American buyers. At the same time, a harsh response from Europe is looming on the horizon. Your $95 billion in punitive tariffs that will hit the American market hard. And if the situation does not change, the global economy could find itself in a state of real economic shock, affecting not only car manufacturers, but also ordinary consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. We are only beginning to realize the consequences of this trade war. Are German car manufacturers facing long-term market losses? Who will emerge victorious in this global economic struggle? And what will happen to buyers who are already facing car shortages and rising prices? We will examine all of this right now. Connect, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the most important events in the global economy. Unfortunately, German automakers such as Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz are facing mounting problems that appear to be only getting worse.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The
we just
numbers
told-
that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
In the first quarter of 2025, these giants reported a sharp drop in profits of more than 40% compared to the previous year, which is an alarming sign not only for the automotive industry, but also for the global economy as a whole. The main reason for this crisis is the decline in sales in China, which has long been one of the main markets. But if we look deeper, we find that there is an even more serious threat behind this, caused by the political situation in the US, or more precisely, the trade war that the heated White House is waging with Europe. The tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump are beginning to put unimaginable pressure on leading car companies, which are already feeling their position in the US market weakening. It gets worse. In response to the increase in duties from 25% to 50%, which Trump announced on May 23, 2025, Germany's largest automakers are forced to revise their strategic plans. The US president issued an ultimatum: if companies do not move their factories and production facilities to the US, their products will be subject to 50% tariffs. This was not a proposal, it was an ultimatum, a threat that led to economic panic among all major European car manufacturers. Now, instead of openly fighting to maintain their positions, companies find themselves in a strategic trap. And while a few months ago they could count on the support of their regular customers, the situation has now changed dramatically.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Volkswagen, Beam, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, and Porsche are all frozen in anticipation. Instead of responding immediately to the challenge, they have begun to act much more cautiously, slowing down their deliveries, adjusting production schedules, and taking steps to minimize losses. At first glance, this may seem like mere maneuvering, but in reality, it is a sign that these companies are on the brink of a global economic crisis. Everything they have done in the past to remain competitive is now under threat. The strategies that have allowed them to dominate the American market for decades are no longer working. What will happen next? Since the introduction of the first tariffs on cars, the situation has been deteriorating with each passing day. The American market, which has long been the largest for European brands, is now turning into a battlefield. In response to rising tariffs, Volkswagen and other car companies have not only slowed down, but also completely suspended some deliveries to the US. Audi, for example, announced a freeze on all deliveries to the American market, causing panic among dealers and consumers. Soon, Porsche and Mercedes-Benz also began freezing deliveries and raising prices on their cars to cope with rising costs. BMW made a similar move, increasing prices on its popular models, such as the 2 Series, making them less affordable for American buyers. And this is just the beginning. After all, the situation with car tariffs is not just an economic setback for German manufacturers. It is a threat that could affect other areas, including local production, sales, and overall relations between countries. If tariffs are indeed increased to 50% in the coming weeks, as Trump has promised, German automakers will find themselves in an incredibly difficult situation. They will have no choice but to move production to the US or face an even greater drop in sales.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The biggest problem is that companies such as Volkswagen, Audi, and Mercedes depend on their European factories for car production. Not all of their models are assembled in America. For example, Audi's most popular cars, such as the Q5 and A5, are assembled in Europe or Mexico, making them dependent on supplies that are now subject to additional taxes. With such dependence on external supplies, German companies will not be able to remain competitive in the American market if tariffs continue to rise. And with each passing day, this crisis will become more and more severe.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
As for the Chinese market, which has long been one of the most profitable for German brands, the situation there is also unstable. Sales in China are declining, and competition from local Chinese manufacturers such as BYD and Geely is only intensifying. Chinese cars are becoming more affordable and competitive, which further complicates the task for European automakers. And although they are still trying to strengthen their position in China, it is likely that their share of this market will continue to decline. Shortly after the introduction of the new tariffs, European companies began to feel not only financial pressure, but also more serious consequences. Some suppliers dependent on cars manufactured in Europe began to cut production. Others simply stopped working with European brands, fearing further sanctions and instability. The European automotive industry is now facing a problem that it could not have predicted. If this situation continues, German brands may find themselves unable to even cover their basic costs. Thus, the crisis caused by tariffs and global trade wars is becoming a catalyst for serious changes in the automotive market. With each passing day, it becomes clearer that German automakers must either adapt to the new world or face the impossibility of maintaining their positions.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
The trade war between the US and the European Union continues to change the global economic landscape. For several weeks now, major German automakers such as Audi, Porsche, and Mercedes-Benz have been trying to adapt to new conditions, both predictable and unpredictable. Whereas these companies could previously enjoy their status as leaders in the automotive market, they now have to navigate conditions in which tariffs, unprotected supplies, and the threat of further sanctions are becoming an integral part of their strategy. Audi, one of the leading brands, was one of the first to take tough measures. At the beginning of April 2025, the company froze all deliveries of its cars to the US, which sent a loud signal to the entire automotive industry. At that time, Audi had about 37,000 cars in its American warehouses, which was about 2 months' worth of inventory. It was expected that these cars would be gradually sold off until the company found a way to get around the tariff issue. However, as of May, the situation has not changed. Stocks are running out and deliveries have not resumed. The reason is simple. Audi cars, including popular models such as the Q5, are assembled in Mexico and Germany, and with the increased tariffs, the company cannot afford further deliveries.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Interestingly, this freeze on deliveries has not only affected the US market. Within a couple of weeks, Audi was forced to admit that delivery delays were beginning to affect its reputation. The company is concealing the true extent of the problem, but sources within the company report that this decision was extremely painful. Moreover, Audi has decided not to launch new models in the US in the near future, which is unlikely to please fans of the brand. This move has intensified competition, with Porsche and Mercedes-Benz taking similar steps. Porsche, although it has not frozen all deliveries, has significantly reduced its export volumes. The realization that companies operating exclusively on imports could suffer huge losses under the new duties and tariffs forced Porsche to hastily revise its strategy. The company rushed to ship an additional 5,000 cars to the US before the tariffs came into effect in an attempt to create a reserve and mitigate the impact. However, their models, including the popular 911 series, are now also subject to price increases. This is not just a 4% increase, as was the case with Audi, but an additional burden that will gradually be passed on to buyers. As for Mercedes-Benz, one of the world's leading manufacturers of premium cars, it has also been forced to adjust its tactics. Like Porsche, it increased its car stocks in the US but began to face a shortage of supplies to Europe. As a result, Mercedes suspended several models on the US market and announced significant budget cuts for production needs in the US. The company emphasized that this is not a temporary measure, but part of a long-term strategy aimed at maintaining its presence in the US while minimizing losses. At the same time, Beam, which has always prided itself on its efficient supply chain, was not prepared for such a decline. Back in April, the company announced that it would suspend all deliveries of several of its models to the US, including the popular 2 Series and 3 Series. Unlike other brands, Beam tried to find a compromise by lowering the price of some cars to maintain demand. However, this decision proved controversial, as such discounts did not cover all the losses caused by the tariffs. Interestingly, the company also decided to freeze the release of new models, which was another worrying sign for investors and consumers. Amid all these supply issues, European automakers are facing another threat: higher prices for their cars. This isn't just about raising the cost of a model. It's a whole strategy to make up for losses from the new tariffs. According to a source at Mercedes-Benz, the company once considered raising prices, but now it has become a necessity. Otherwise, we will not be able to hold on to the market. Moreover, as it turns out, not all models can be so flexible in terms of price segment. For example, Porsche was forced to raise prices by several $1,000s due to increased demand for luxury models, which automatically reduces their appeal to buyers with limited budgets. And what about ordinary American buyers who are accustomed to the quality and prestige of German brands? The situation is no less painful for them. Due to high tariffs, car shortages, and rising prices, they are facing a real limitation in their choices. Buyers who were planning to purchase new cars are now facing waiting lists for new models, while the cost of cars on the secondary market is rising. In some US cities, dealers have already started raising prices for cars that until recently could be purchased at the standard price. All these events, coupled with the European Union's retaliatory measures, will have serious economic consequences, not only for car manufacturers but also for the US economy itself. As soon as the European Commission unveils its retaliatory tariffs, American companies will face even higher duties on their products, leading to additional costs and, most likely, a drop in sales in Europe. Not only a political crisis looms on the horizon, but also an economic crisis that will have global consequences. German car makers are not ready to leave the US, but if the situation does not change in the coming months, they may have to make the most difficult choice in their history: relocate production to the US or cut their losses and leave the market. The trade war between the US and the European Union, which has gripped the automotive industry in recent months, has already begun to have irreversible consequences for manufacturers and consumers. However, the consequences of this crisis affect not only individual players, but also threaten the very stability of the economies of both countries. The retaliatory measures being prepared by the European Union will be global in nature, covering not only the automotive market, but also industries such as aviation, agriculture, energy, and high technology. In response to the sharp increase in US tariffs, the European Commission has prepared a retaliatory package worth €95 billion, which could affect not only cars but also goods such as American whiskey, motorcycles, agricultural products, and air transport. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that American car manufacturers, which previously had a strong position in the European market, are now also facing a real threat. For example, Ford and General Motors, which have been selling their cars on European markets for decades, are now facing a high barrier in the form of new tariffs. This has led to a sharp decline in sales and, in some European countries, to a complete halt in production. It is expected that if tariffs on cars remain at this level, American companies will either have to relocate production to the EU or face devastating consequences for their businesses. The situation is getting worse every day, and more car makers, like Tesla, are thinking about moving their production to Europe. At the same time, Germany is preparing for the hardest economic blow in decades. Research conducted by the IFO Institute in Munich shows that against the backdrop of new tariffs and the expected response from the European Union, the German economy could lose up to 2% of its GDP. Car exports, which account for almost half of the German automotive industry's revenue, could dry up completely, leading to job losses and mass layoffs in logistics companies. Many German car makers have already started cutting production, and car assembly plants in the US and Canada, which were recently considered profitable, are now on the verge of shutting down. These events could cause a chain reaction across Europe. In EU countries such as France and Italy, many large car factories depend on German supplies. In response to potential losses from high tariffs, the European Commission is preparing to introduce new duties on US goods, which could affect entire industries, including agriculture, aviation, and high technology. This move could be a catalyst for global economic instability. American companies, in turn, will face challenges they have not encountered in decades. But it is not only American giants that will find themselves in difficulty. Even high-tech companies such as Apple are already beginning to feel the effects of trade sanctions. As for German automakers, their next steps will be decisive. They may face a difficult choice: either start large-scale production in the US or accept a reduction in their position in the American market. Audi, for example, is already considering opening new production facilities in the US, which would allow them to circumvent tariffs and remain competitive. At the same time, Porsche, which focuses on premium cars, may start producing its cars at US plants to minimize costs and continue operating in the world's largest market. The problem is that so far no company is ready to take steps that could entail additional risks.